Now, 11 students who occupied University of Manchester buildings in protest at high rents and poor living conditions
You occupied these buildings. Did you not think there would be a consequence?
Protests by their very nature are disruptive. We wouldn't be very good protesters if we weren't disrupting
Cost of living now, because around 160 students at the University of Manchester are refusing to pay their rent.
There's been studies, 1 in 10 students has relied on a food bank at some point. Mental health, the amount of students that are having to work full time, it's genuinely ridiculous.
So, hi Fraser, welcome to the Post-Crash Podcast. So really excited to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, that's completely right. Really pleased to do it as well. And, I think it's really important that talking about this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So I was listening to a podcast you did on YouTube, and you mentioned this imagery of people coming in, I think bailiffs, forcing you out. Could you describe what happened there?
Oh yeah, so this was at the end of last year, and obviously myself along with a number of other students were taking part in an occupation was part of the campaign to get the university to cut rents in student halls. And what the university ended up doing is they took out a court order from the High Court, which would allow them to basically send bailiffs in to drag students out of this occupation. All this occupation was saying is we want the uni to listen to us and negotiate. There wasn't even a necessary specific demand, but rather than that, they paid these bailiffs actually, tens of thousands of pounds it cost the university. Mm-hmm. Pretty bad. Around 5-6 a.m. A number of students who are in this occupation, the door gets partially ripped down by bailiffs. They come in with sort of torches, body cameras, all that sort of thing, and just carry people out of this building, which people are just being dragged out, dumped on the floor outside, which is pretty bad. And I think it's the fact that that's the uni's response to this is people protest by students saying we would like to negotiate, we want a seat at the table to talk about the issues a lot of students facing, and the uni's just spent I think it was 30 or 40,000 pounds it cost the university to pay those, professional bailiffs to come and drag people out. And it's just seems ridiculous to me that is the response and that's their go-to, rather than saying maybe we should negotiate with these students. It's, let's have them dragged out. And there were some pretty shocking images of that. There was one of me when 4 bailiffs carrying me out by my arms and legs. And it was, not a nice experience, and the fact that the uni put students through that is ridiculous, I think.
So I definitely want to go through the whole story, how the whole rent strike started and everything. But before that, I just wanted to ask, so did the university end up negotiating in the end? Did they make a response or anything like that?
So no, there was never any formal negotiation from the university. The pressure from the rent strikes and a lot of the negative media coverage did see the uni put down the rent in Whitworth Park. So they put that down, I think, by about £600 over the year. And the media coverage of Oak House, especially, which was, the worst sort of quality accommodation, they refurbished that because it did get a lot of very bad media attention. But there was no sort of formal negotiation. There was no overall rent decrease. And, students are now paying more for most rent than they were last year. Which is, with the cost of living crisis and these issues, it's really bad.
Yeah, I guess it's worse with inflation because it's not just rent, it's basic cost of living prices have gone up. Would you say the support has gone up at the same level as the costs associated with being a student?
I really don't think it has at all. I think, where the support does come a lot of the time, it's out of the surplus they make. Mm-hmm. So, you're still paying more into it. And I think what's really bad about the accommodation, especially at Uni of Manchester, is the uni does make a surplus on the accommodation. So not all the money that they make from the rent goes back into rent or accommodation, which other universities do. So I think, not when they put the rent up, it's not just about their costs that have increased. There is a surplus which they're operating under, which is very bad. I'm not sure if it was the top, but last year the Uni of Manchester was in the top 3 highest operating surpluses for any university in the country, and over £10 million of that surplus came from accommodation, which is really bad. I think for most students, rent is the single biggest expense, and it's the single biggest thing that sees students struggle or have to take out extra loans, pick up extra work, that sort of thing.
So that said, at what point did you feel like you wanted to join the rent strike movement?
I think it was around the start of January where more and more people started getting involved in the rent strike, and I heard about sort of the plan and ideas for it around November last year. At this point, I'd come along to uni. I'd come in, so first time renting essentially, and I was going into halls. I've been working for a few years, but obviously I've lived with my parents for uni, that sort of thing. And then suddenly you just sort of come along to uni, and it's a bit shocking, how the quality, sort of the combination of the quality of the accommodation and how much I'm paying for it is, I'm getting my maintenance loan coming in, and I'm already on a substantially increased maintenance loan because parents' income, but I'm still spending a huge chunk of that, if not all of it, on rent the second it comes in, which is really worrying. And it's like, me having to be like, all right, I'm going to have to make sure I'm working all over the holidays so I'm able to afford this stuff. And then sort of speaking to older students who'd been in the same accommodation 2-3 years earlier, and them saying, it was £500 cheaper, £600 cheaper, like literally just 2-3 years ago. And that's when I was like, I think it's really important that students like myself and then my mates and everyone like that has to actually, try and do some sort of campaign around this, because it is a massive issue and students are really losing out, I think, on it.
So how did the campaign start? Was it just like a bunch of students in halls who kind of just started talking about what's going on, or was it like a bit more like formal?
So there was never like too much formal work around it. So it was mostly led by the students in halls, although there were some older students who have more experience with sort of dealing with the university, with sort of student politics, that sort of thing. Who were supporting around it, but it was very much led by people in first year and students in halls, having meetings, sort of getting around like, how can we do a campaign on this? What is the best idea to put pressure on the university? That sort of thing.
That's crazy. So that must have been like a wild experience for first year, like moving into a new like city, a new university, and just kind of being thrown into that whole like ordeal of like the rent strike. How did it feel like, just like, I don't know, as a first year in a completely new environment, like doing what kind of became history, like something really impactful, got loads of media coverage, got talked about like all over campus, all over the country. So how did that feel, like being part of something like that?
I think it at some points it felt also a bit overwhelming, but I think it was the fact that it was, predominantly being led by first year students, so much like, especially with the media coverage, all it was just people talking about their honest experiences. It wasn't, a lot of it almost seemed like common sense. We have these massive issues with rent, a load of students are really struggling. So, something does have to happen about it. We can't, just not doing anything is actually just going to help it make it worse. And, while we didn't succeed in certain areas, like getting the rent put down in every halls, being able to get the media coverage of the really, really bad stuff and get it refurbished, I do see that as a win. And I think it was just really important to do. And I almost, I think like quite a lot of the other first years, no one sort of set out to be like, yeah, I'm going to be super involved in this campaign, but people just ended up taking on responsibilities, chatting to other, I would often just go and like meet up with first year students who are concerned about the safety of the rent strike, and I'd say, let's go and grab a drink, we'll have a chat about it and stuff like that. So you also had sort of a lot of people informally just ended up getting very involved and taking on a lot of responsibilities, which I think is part of the success of how it built as a campaign. It was just a lot of first year students who are honestly just struggling a lot, wanting to get involved with this, what is at the end of the day a political campaign, trying to put pressure on the university. So yeah, it was a very interesting experience getting involved in it, but I think it was very positive experience for a lot of people. And also, it builds up a strong sense of, showing the power of actually, mobilizing students, how you can find these issues and you can get, students who aren't necessarily political or aren't necessarily always aware of these issues, and you can get them sort of riled up about it, finding out how much your rent's gone up since last year, even though it's the exact same accommodation. When it's gone up above inflation, I think it's just unacceptable, really. I think it made a lot of people quite angry, but that saw more and more people get involved.
I guess it helps when you have people kind of to do that research for you, like to actually make it clear like how much rent's gone up? Because when you're a first year student, it's not really like something you compare. Like you won't be comparing this year's rent and last year's rent. That's not really something that would occur to you, would it? Until like you kind of see other people talk about it and it kind of snowballs into something bigger. So I want to hear the next part of the story. So you mentioned it started off informally, a couple of students kind of talking about the cost of living, the quality of the accommodation. Did you have any goals in mind, or was it like, let's do something and we'll see what happened?
So I think we were definitely focused in it, wanting to focus it all around the rent, and ideally a reduction in rent was the big thing, because like we said, that was the thing we identified, that this is the biggest expense for, pretty much any student that's, getting any sort of maintenance loan. They'll probably be spending most of it on their rent. So we thought, this is one of the easiest ways the university can respond to cost of living and these issues with the students is a reduction in rent. At this point, we didn't have like a specific demand because we thought, it's up to everyone that gets involved to have a say in this. We need to sort of decide this as a group or a campaign and having people involved. It's not sort of necessarily best idea for just a small group of people to come up with these demands first. We should sort of see what people want to do with it. What actually ended up coming out of that is, as well as wanting a reduction in rent, a lot of students who got involved said, we need, when the university is building new accommodation, they have to be building it affordably. They can't, there are lots of issues where the newer the accommodation being built is the most expensive often. And, the National Union of Students has like a definition of affordable. And I think at the moment, only like one or two of the Union Manchester accommodations is even classed as like in any way affordable. Some of it's, which over £180 a week is just not good at all. And it's making it increasingly difficult for a lot of students. And that actually ended up becoming one of the demands is, for the university to, when it's building new accommodation, to make sure that, at least a certain percentage of it is affordable. So, that was quite big, but yeah, I think it was very successful in sort of the way that the demands reflected what a lot of the first years who got involved wanted to see. But yeah.
And then how did the media get involved? Did you like start off with the rent strikes, or did you have like steps before that? And like, that was kind of like the last resort. Like how did the rent strike itself come about?
So yeah, I think this was one of the next bits. Obviously, there's been like historic rent strikes and stuff you could like research and how the successes and failures of these. And while it's quite a radical step, it's always been historically quite positive at being able to apply pressure on financial like institutions like the university. And it's also quite a big media thing, so that it was sort of worked out by quite a lot of people. This is a good tactic for building up our campaign. So once we started getting people to sign up to RentStrike, so before anyone had actually started withholding rent, but once, we had 200 students saying, I'm going to RentStrike, at that point we started trying to reach out to media and being like, look, there's something going on here at Manchester. Because I mean, it was in that early part of January when most people haven't even come back to university. So people are going to be doing essays, it's exam season, but you've still got hundreds of university students saying, I'm actually not going to pay my rent. I don't want to do this. So, we reached out to me and said, this is a significant step. Students are obviously angry, and there's obviously a really big issue here because the idea of not paying a multi-thousand-pound rent payment is scary to a lot of people. It's quite, it's not a step people take without thinking about it. It's not a step people would just take, for a bit of a laugh, because, rent is a very serious thing, and thousands of pounds of debt is obviously massive. So the fact that so many students were getting involved, from the uni's own data, we now know it was around 385 students for that January payment, January the 19th. So, in just under 3 weeks, 385 students had signed up to basically not pay their rent for this rent strike. So yeah, getting the media sort of aware that this campaign was going on, and providing them with updates, saying like, 50 more people have signed up today. So obviously people are angry. And then sort of writing up these sort of like research points, like looking at how much money is the university making, how does that link to the accommodation, how much has the rent gone up, was also really important, I think, because we were then able to share that both with students and with also the media to sort of get them to focus on this. I think that the big statistic that always, I still remember is that the uni it made last year £120 million operating surplus, and it has over £1.5 billion in its reserves. So in terms of the demands of a rent strike, saying we want a rent reduction, that is very, very doable for the university with their surplus and the reserves that they have. I think those sort of things really came together, like the research aspect and reaching out to the media, which sort of built up the profile of the campaign. We had people's parents sort of encouraging their kids to rent strike. They saw it, and I think it was good, and it also put people's minds at ease. It wasn't just, oh, it's my flatmate saying, oh, you shouldn't pay your rent tomorrow. It's it's a campaign which is getting media attention. I think it was really important.
That's really positive to hear, like a lot of these students coming together for like a common purpose. So you mentioned rent strikes. So just during that period of time, during January, did you face any like major backlash or challenge from either students or like, I don't know, the university? I'm sure they started to like hear about what's going on.
So there wasn't that massively amounts of challenging from students, because a lot of the research we did was around sort of the legality of it. So we were able to say, these are the risks, but there are also these things you don't have to worry about. Like, for example, the uni can't charge interest on the rent if you don't pay it. So, you're not going to end up paying twice as much if you don't pay now as you will. So we had a lot of things to sort of reassure students. So there wasn't really that much challenge or opposition from a lot of students, I think. And you could tell often the students that were involved were those who were in sort of the lower quality and less expensive accommodation. So there's obviously, I think, a link there with like a lot of people almost needed to rent strike, because a lot of people, the rent is that big of an expense that it makes a big difference in terms of like even being able to like what food you're buying and sort of that social life, that sort of thing. There were some always, especially in the media, I did a couple of sort of the interviews and things like that early on, where you get some of the arguments and some of the responses are, the sort of thing you would expect to get from people who haven't been to university in 40 years and don't know what it's like. Something people are like, oh, well, uni students are spending all their money on, social life and going out and stuff like that. And, my response to that was always, if you're getting yourself into tens of thousands of pounds of debt, you should be able to go out for a drink or food with your mates if you want. That's not a criticism of it. And when your main expense is the rent, which is increasing above inflation very significantly, that is always the bigger issue. So there was some backlash from the public in those ways, but often it was quite easy to respond and say, actually, well, try and do these individual criticisms of how students might spend their disposable income doesn't, get around the fact that there is a fundamental issue, I think, in higher education and in the way university students are in increasingly expensive accommodation. And there's so many issues with even now the reason our vice chancellor's asked for tuition fees to go up is because they say they're struggling with that, and it just seems really unsustainable, the whole way the higher education system is currently structured. So a lot of the backlash from the public we were able to sort of put down with that. In terms of the university, the main issue we had is that we now know it not to be true, but they were their response to the media was to try and play it down. So the university had put out statements being like, oh, we don't think many students are rent striking. We've asked some students if they're rent striking, and only like 60 said yes or something like that. But we specifically told students not to tell the university they were rent striking. So that, that's obviously not a particularly good data gathering from the uni there. And they were trying to like play it down all the time in the media, like trying to make it seem less than it was, which I think is sort of, it's a tactic which often gets used against these sort of campaigns, is trying to make them seem less serious, make them seem smaller. But we were able to do a freedom of information request on the university, which is where we found out, nearly 385 students were rent striking in January, which is actually a huge number really when you think about it. And the fact that the uni was trying to play it down to the media, I think was quite serious, but it also showed that they were taking it seriously, because, they were concerned about how many students were getting sort of angry and mobilizing around this issue.
How do you go about the request? Did you do it directly? Did you have to like get someone to do it for you?
So I'd never really done anything like this before. I didn't really the law about freedom of information and any of that sort of thing. But there's a form somewhere it's quite difficult to find on the university's website about, submitting a freedom of information request. And you have to be like incredibly specific about the data you're asking for. But, they have to provide you with that answer, under law about freedom of information. So it was really effective for us to be able to get hold of it. But yeah, I know a number of other students were really important with doing sort of these freedom of information requests and that sort of work. And it gave us a lot of information, which otherwise we probably wouldn't be able to get hold of, but which ended up being very helpful for the campaign, I think.
Brilliant. And then, so January rent strike. So how did that then snowball into getting dragged out from your accommodation or from a uni building? How did that happen? Or what was the transition between rent strikes and that image you painted at the start?
So there's about 2 months in between those, which is probably one of the most hectic 2 months of my life, and maybe to the detriment of my some of my coursework, which I was doing in that period. But so obviously the rent strike went ahead originally to like a lot of success in terms of media stuff. Once it was on the news, nearly 400 students at the Uni of Manchester are rent striking over unfair rent. It put a huge amount of attention on the university. And it raised a lot of sort of public information and stuff like that, which was really good. And the uni's response was just to deny and to play down and to basically ignore the strike. They refused to negotiate, really, which is all we wanted was, sit down with a few students in a room and actually listen to their concerns and listen to their stories and experiences of how that really high rent is negatively affecting them. That's what we want. And they, just point blank refused to do that. There was no attempts to do anything like this. The uni tried to fine students for it, which is, ridiculous, really. When you're protesting overly high rent during the cost of living crisis, if your first response is we're going to try and fine you, it seems ridiculous. So, a number of people were discussing, when we look at the history of sort of protest and campaigns at universities, one form of protest which has always been really visible is occupying buildings, people going into somewhere doing like a sit-in, saying we're not leaving until you come and speak to us, you go and negotiate, and out of that a lot of students said actually I think this is a really good idea, both because it will get them a lot of the media looking at the rent strike, which will mean more people learning about the finances of the university and how bad it is. And also, hopefully it will pressure the university into listening to us because, surely they will listen to us, I think. And then, so a lot of students, I think probably well over 100 in total, took part in occupying a number of university buildings, including sort of the senior management building. People sort of paint banners, put them out of windows, that sort of thing, and try and do these. And still the university did nothing. If anything, they sort of actually tried to, target some of the students they saw as being involved in this. I remember doing it around this time. I did an interview with, I think the Tab newspaper at Manchester, because I did another freedom of information request where I just asked for emails of my name, like between senior management, and they'd been like speculating about my financial situation. Wow. And being like, do some of the students who are like very like publicly facing in the campaign, like the people doing media interviews, are they really like struggling? And it's like, yes, yes. But the fact that this is, the fact that these people on, 200, nearly £300,000 salaries are, rather than just sitting down and discussing with students, they're trying to do like stalking their finances and trying to work out their parents' income and all that sort of stuff, which is really weird. Just give people a seat at the table, just actually listen to students. That's all you have to do. And they refused to. So the occupations carried on, and, a lot of students got involved in it. And I think it was quite a positive space, having these sort of student areas as like a political campaign where anyone can come in and have, chats about it and their own issues. I think it was very positive having that sort of community space, which I think a lot of young people don't often get really nowadays, where you're meeting completely new people. And bonding over that sort of campaign, that sort of thing, and sort of being in a communal area almost. And then at that point, the uni basically got fed up. They didn't want to negotiate. They'd basically decided early on they weren't going to have any discussion with students about this. So they went to court and they got a possession order, which basically meant bailiffs were going to be able to come in and drag students out, which was really concerning because it's a very rare thing that universities do. They don't do that often. But I think recent changes in like the government legislation around protest law and that sort of thing has made it easier for sort of universities to be anti certain like campaigns and protests. And I think that played a role in them getting these bailiffs in. And so we found out, at some point, probably in the next week or so, the uni is going to try and evict all the students from these, what are fundamentally disruptive but peaceful occupations, where the goal is just negotiation. If the uni wants to end the occupation, all they have to say is, let's go and have a chat about this. And so, they went to bailiffs. We knew this was going to happen at some point, but not when. So a lot of people are like, right, look, we're going to sleep in the occupation, so we're there 24/7, so we can respond to this. I had to take a few days off my lectures when we knew that was going on, but I thought it was really important. Yeah, which wasn't ideal, but it was. I thought it was important to be able to do that and sort of actually show people that this is what the uni is trying to do, and get these responses in. And then at about 5 a.m. One day, this door of this room we're sleeping in basically just gets like half ripped off its hinges. Bailiffs just come in and people just getting dragged out of this building. I think part of the reason it was so important that there were like quite a few students there is so people could film it and record it, because often they didn't. Why did the uni send these people in at 5 in the morning?
I was going to say it's pretty early.
Building, I think it's because there's not going to be anyone around. There's not going to be anyone to respond to it. I think it's just an incredibly concerning attitude from the university that students are having a really serious issue. They want to talk about this, and the uni has absolutely no way for them to do that. I mean, so one criticism that I've heard before, which I disagree with, is couldn't the RentStrike have tried to do other methods? And it's like, we did a referendum with the university on reducing rent, I think around this time last year, and it was over 10,000, I think over 11,000 students actually voted in that referendum, which, as far as I'm aware, is the biggest single issue referendum at the University of Manchester, which is also one of the biggest universities in the country. So, there's this huge, well over 10,000 students saying we want this to happen, like through the university's own democratic processes. And they still say no. They still say no to negotiation. They still say no to meeting with or listening to students involved in this, but they will pay £40,000 for bailiffs to come and drag people out of a building, which probably I wouldn't recommend the experience to anyone. It's not very fun having that happen. And I just think it's, it really shows what the university thinks of a lot of the student population, I think, which is very concerning to me, is that was their response to it. But yeah.
Thank you for painting that whole picture, because I was always wondering like how that image actually came into being, and you painted this whole journey, this whole story, and it's absolutely incredible to see that. Just before we start wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, what was the aftermath? So what happened as a result, A, and B, what to expect next? Because I still see posts by the RentStrike. So I'm just curious, do you guys have any plans for the upcoming year?
So first thing, in terms of the aftermath, the university tried to basically target the people they thought were the organisers. So myself and 10 of the students had a disciplinary panel with the university disciplinary panel, which is the highest possible level of disciplinary panel that they can take you to. Obviously, no one was suspended or expelled, but I think they did it as a threat. They said, they knew who the most visible people were in the campaign, even though, they weren't sort of key, they weren't leaders of the campaign. They were just people who did media interviews and stuff like that, but the uni still targeted them, which is, a very stressful thing to be doing, especially coming up to exam period and having sort of be investigated by the university. It was very concerning. And I think, that wasn't good. And, while the campaign had some successes around, getting the rent put down in Whitworth Hall, and in terms of the quality of accommodation, getting the refurbishments, which did cost, I think, around £20 million. So, there were some successes here. But at the end of the day, the rent is still going up. And I think while we made a really important impact in terms of raising the public sort of view on university finances and on accommodation, I think there is still a lot to go. I know, so obviously I'm second year now, so I'm not in university halls, out of Oak House now. So yeah, I'm private renting, where you have actually even less rights as a tenant. But I've been doing some work with the Greater Manchester Tenants Union, who are really good in sort of supporting students who might be having issues with their landlords, that sort of thing. And I know a lot of other students from last year who were involved in the rent strike have, now they're private tenants, and now they're renting sort of in the private sector. They've become involved in the tenants union as well, which is, a really valuable resource for students who are renting. But yeah, so I think that, there's a new group of first years who are dealing with the rent strike account now. I very much would encourage, any first years to get involved with that, because, while we only got some successes last year, I think it had a bit, everyone that was involved, I think, had an impact on them. A lot of people will always remember, being part of a campaign which mobilized hundreds and hundreds of students and had massive media attention. And it showed, how much demand there is for this sort of change, how important it is that we do tackle these unsustainable issues in higher education finances and sort of the way accommodation is structured. So, I'm hoping, and, I'm always happy giving my time to helping the first years and people that are, trying to keep this rent strike campaign going. I still haven't actually paid my rent for paid my rent for first year. So the uni hasn't actually quite been able to get that back yet. Although I know, a lot of students have, over sort of the university's sort of various threats to try and take people to court and things, which, again, I just find concerning. But I really hope to see the rent strike continue next year. I think, so it'll be around January again, the next rent payment. And I'm hoping to see sort of over Christmas and into January some sort of success. And, and beyond the rent strike, I think it shows a lot of students for the first time that, there is such thing as making political change through other avenues that aren't necessarily, just going and voting in an election. If you get enough people involved in a campaign, you can put pressure on the people who make these decisions, whether it's about your rent or whether it's about stuff like that. And that, you have power as a group of people, you have power, organizing like that. And I think that was a success for a lot of people. And that's why a lot of people, I think, are more politicized, and, more conscious of their own power, in terms of trying to do campaigns like this. So, I think there were a lot of successes, and I do hope that the first years again are able to sort of keep up that sort of pressure, because, it's the issues that are facing students aren't going away. No one's going to wake up one day, not having a cheaper rent, and cost of living crisis completely disappeared and no student debt. So, I think it's up to us to try and tackle that in whatever way we can. So, I think it's really important.
Thank you. And where can students find the work you do, be it the rent strike or the union?
So the rent strike has a big Twitter and an Instagram account, which, I'd really recommend anyone who's in Uni Manchester halls to be looking into. I know actually more other unis have been looking into rent strikes as well, which I think is very important. But, I'd really recommend people look that up. And the tenants union is Greater Manchester Tenants Union, who has a student branch. They've got a website and an Instagram and social medias and that sort of things. And I think, these are really important that people get involved in, because, there's always a way of being involved with no risk at all. It was only 10 of us that got disciplinary, and that was because we were doing all these media interviews last year. So, there isn't a risk in being involved in these things, but it's incredibly important what they can do to you, being involved in these sort of campaigns or an organisation like the Tenants Union. It gives you more protection. You actually find out more about the situation in terms of, where's your rent going, all those sorts of things. I think it just, it builds up, I think, some of that community power, which I think a lot of young people haven't really experienced before coming to university, which I think is, very, very important.
And for my final question, I just want to ask you, for anyone watching, whether they're first years or just like finishing college or final year students, what kind of advice do you have for them, for people who might be interested in campaigning for whatever reason, be it, for a cause like this or something different? What's this one key takeaway you would want them to take home with them?
I think it's that you do have collective power, like any group of people. When you get together, you always have more power than you will think. And, it's really important that people realize that. And, when you are able to mobilize a number of people around an issue, you will see successes that you might not even have expected. And it's really important that you don't prepare for the worst, because, actually collective power can be incredibly strong in challenging, whether it's injustices or trying to make political change. And, you can be incredibly successful with that. That I think that's really important. It's just mobilizing people, and, knowing what you're up against through doing like that sort of research where possible always helps, because being able to tell people, this is where this issue is coming from and this is how it's keeping going. I think, it galvanizes people to want to be involved in that sort of campaign. So, I think collective action is such a big thing. And it's so important that students and young people are getting politicized in that way through collective action, I think. Yeah.
I wanted to end on this one question, which I like asking. I want to try asking everyone. So without knowing who the next person I'm going to interview is, what's one thing you'd like to know about them?
That's quite a difficult question. I'd like to ask them what they think, is the most important way people can try and make change. Really, I think is really good. And, that's something I always find interesting to hear, because people answer it differently depending on their own personal experiences and their, political stance. So, I think that's always a good question to ask.
That's a really good question. I actually want you to answer that as well now.
I think it's having the confidence to be able to challenge what you see as injustices. And it's, I think fundamentally politics has to go, beyond Westminster and that sort of thing. It has to go into communities, it has to go into collective action, whether that's trade unions in the workplace, whether that's organising as local communities, as tenants, however you're doing it. I think that's the way forward. It's community organising, it's collective action, and it's it's being able to understand that politics actually is much more than a lot of people think it is, and it's all of our interpersonal relationships, and we always have to challenge injustices through that, I think.
And sometimes it's getting dragged out with bailiffs.
Sometimes it's getting dragged out of university building at 5 a.m. No one can say it isn't exciting.
Frasers, thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure, people tuning in will take home so much of them. I appreciate that.
That's right. Well, thanks so much for having me on as well. It's been really great to talk about.